you are. All right, whenever you are ready, so are we.
The healthy man does not torture others. Generally, it is the tortured who turn into torturers.
I'm Madison Boyers. This is Rebecca Peacock, Taylor Davis, and Delaney Clark. Our topic was the idea of whether serial killers were born or made, looking back at their pasts. Our overall question was whether were Ted Bundy and Dennis Rader born with a murderous mentality, or did their past experiences create this monster?
What is nature versus nurture? The official definition from Psychology Today of nature is biological factors or genetics, and nurture is the upbringing or life experience a person may experience. In other words, nature is the characteristics you are born with, and nurture is characteristics you develop over time from other influences.
Throughout history, serial killers have terrorized people all over the world. It's been said that serial homicide has been a phenomenon for over 15,000 years. Although the term serial killer excuse me, didn't come about to the 1970s. Jack the Ripper, one of the more famous unidentified serial killers, tortured the city of London in the late 1880s. And he had a brutal way of torturing his victims. It was said that he sent letters to the police informing them of the next murder. And we see this behavior again in serial killers like Dennis Rader more than 100 years later. It's no doubt that these past serial killers have influenced newer people. Although Jack the Ripper and Dennis Rader were from different periods of time, they still had similar motives, mainly control. They have the desire to control people mainly through their victims. Following this dominance also comes an addiction, where they crave more and more. And these characteristics have been observed in serial killers for thousands of years.
Traumatic events experienced during childhood can lead to one exhibiting antisocial or violent behaviors. 40% of serial killers interviewed in the study by Bob Rester, who was an FBI profiler who headed the Criminal Personality Research Project, reported being physically beaten or abused during childhood, while 70% reported witnessing or being part of sexually stressful events as children. Compared to the general population, serial killers have 6 times more reported abuse during childhood. Expert psychologists found in a 2005 study that organized serial killers were most likely to have experienced psychological abuse, while disorganized killers were the least likely from these groups.
I don't feel guilty for anything. I feel sorry for people who feel guilt. Ted Bundy was an illegitimate child who was raised by his grandparents as his mother's brother. He did not find out until later in his life that his mother was his mother, and it greatly upset him. He always aimed for the highest he could. He wanted to obtain a law degree, so he was actually attending college at the time of most of his murders for a law degree. While in college, he fell in love with a wealthy woman who later dumped him, and she resembled a lot of his later victims, and it is believed that that may have been the stressor that caused him to start murdering. 30 of his murders were actually confirmed, but it's believed that he may have killed over 100 women because there were so many missing people reports, and yet they couldn't exactly confirm that he killed all of them. One of his ways of luring victims was pretending to be injured. Witnesses who saw the women who were murdered interacting with him reported that he always seemed very charming and tended to fake an injury to seek sympathy and help. Some of his victims were Karen Sparks, who was beaten and suffered brain damage, but she did survive. She was one of the lucky few who did, although it permanently damaged her life. Linda Ann Healy was abducted, but her remains were later found in his estate, I believe, that he had. They found a lot of women's skulls there, and that's how they kind of knew that he had killed over 30 women. Donna Gale Manson, he stated that he burned her skull in a fireplace of his girlfriend's apartment, so they knew for a fact that she had been murdered by him. And then you have Carol DeRanche. She was almost abducted, but she managed to escape. She got into his car, but quickly realized what was happening and got out. Ted Bundy also managed to escape prison twice. The first time he was immediately caught. The second time he committed his last 3 murders. 2 college women and then a 12-year-old who did not deserve what she got. He was executed in 1989 by electric chair.
Inside the mind of Ted Bundy had lots of mental problems, including being a diagnosed psychopath, necrophilia, which is an attraction towards corpses, sadism, which is pleasure in hurting others, antagonism, which is an obsession with being the bad guy, narcissism, which is to always be right or to think you're always right, and likely more undiagnosed illnesses. Most of these traits were developed throughout his childhood and young adulthood.
Bundy is suspected to have suffered some sort of abuse. Psychiatrist Dr. Dorothy Lewis explains that the behavior exhibited by Bundy is, quote-unquote, only seen in very seriously traumatized children who have either themselves been the victims of extraordinary abuse or have witnessed extreme violence among family members. Ted Bundy falls under the nurture category, as much evidence shows that his past experience played a large role in his murder sentences.
You don't have any control over it. You try and put it away, but that doesn't work. I mean, it's not accepted by society, but it's like an alcohol or a drug person. You know, they're going to blame it on the drugs or alcohol. They are going to say they couldn't control it. Dennis Rader was your average, typical married man. He was the president of his church, and he actually saved a young boy's life when he was 15 to 16 years old. He exhibited very little signs towards his family that he was evil or that he was capable of committing murders. Everyone who knew his good side did not believe that he committed these crimes or was a murderer, but the people who knew his bad side weren't as surprised. His bad side came out as he worked as a police officer. He would abuse his power, he would murder dogs, and he would stalk women. Some of his victims, or all of his victims, there were around 10 of them. The first large group, I guess you could say, was a family. You had Joseph Oterio, Julie Oterio, Joseph Oterio Jr., and Josephine, who were all murdered in their home. Their 3 older children later found the bodies of their parents when they arrived home from school. Their younger siblings were found in the basement, and police had been the one to find them, which was better for the psyche of the 3 older children. You have Catherine Bright, who was at home with her brother at the time. She did not survive, but her brother survived a gunshot to the head. Shirley Vane was a mother of 3. She was killed while her 3 children were locked in the bathroom after her 5-year-old let Dennis Rader in. The last few who were killed, I don't know much about, but I know that Nancy Fox had been strangled, Maureen Hedge was abducted, another victim was Vicky Wildrew, who her husband was actually thought to have killed her, but it turns out that he didn't. And then you have Dolores Davis, who was an elderly woman who was Dennis Rader's last victim before he went off the map for around 30 years, I believe. He was caught in 2005 after he resurfaced and taunted the police. He sent them a floppy disk taunting them that they wouldn't be able to trace it back to him. They actually traced it back to him through his church, and that's how he was caught. He is currently serving 10 consecutive life terms, as death row was not an option at the time he was caught.
Inside the mind of Dennis Rader, or the BTK killer. The BTK killer was sadistic like Ted Bundy, which means he enjoyed hurting others. He was narcissistic, which also like Ted Bundy means he thinks he's always correct, and he had antisocial disorder. And the concerning thing about his mind, other than the fact that he murdered people, is that Dennis Rader had no regrets except for that he let himself be caught by police. Dennis was born with many of these traits, having these since he was young.
Dennis Rader's childhood was the opposite of Ted Bundy's, though. Rader said himself that he had a, quote, unremarkable childhood with no abuse. He was an average student, Boy Scout, and an active church member. He falls under the nature category, as there were not any specific traumatic events he experienced that would aid in turning him into a killer.
Some of the solutions would be therapy, mainly starting out with childhood. Starting it early would help develop, it would help deal with some of these personality disorders sooner rather than later. In adults, it's a little harder to control a personality disorder, and some of these limitations would be that they may not realize that they need help, they may not realize that they have a personality disorder or something that may cause them to kill until it's too late, and they may not want this help. They may see it as something that would help them.
In conclusion, we believe that Ted Bundy was a made serial killer. The factors in his life point to this, as he suffered many traumatic events during his childhood. And we also believe that Dennis Rader was born as a serial killer, as there were no traumatic events in his childhood.
All through history, there have been tyrants and murderers, and for a time they can seem invincible, but in the end, they always fall. Always.
Okay, thank you. All right, Addison, let's start with you. What is a way in which your team's resolution makes you think differently about your own individual research?
My research was mainly on the historical point of view, and our solution was more on the therapy, more of a scientific or health point of view. And I didn't really focus on that in my paper, and it altered my thinking. Maybe because if they would have had like this therapy earlier in history, maybe this could have prevented a lot.
All right. Rebecca, give one specific way that your thinking changed as a result of learning about Delaney's findings.
I realized abuse and a childhood plays a big part into shaping someone's future. You see, with Ted Bundy, his grandparents hiding the truth about his birth to him and making him pretend to be his mother's brother had such an effect on his psyche and his worth in life. He felt inferior because he was a child born out of wedlock. So that changed my thoughts about how young childhoods and the way adults deal with children around them can affect how someone grows up.
Okay. Delaney, what is an example of a compelling argument from one of your peers' individual reports that you decided to exclude from your team presentation, and why?
In Addison's paper, she kind of argued that throughout history there were not as many ways to help people, and we didn't really include that in our presentation.
Okay. And Taylor, what is the way in which your team resolution makes you think differently about your individual research?
Our our team resolution was, like Addison said, that therapy would help a lot and childhood programs would help a lot in reducing the amount of serial killers. And in my research, I focused on the scientific, like, genetics of that. So therapy couldn't really prevent that because it's genetics, you're born with it.
All right, thank you guys.